Hi, my name's Nicola. I'm a mum. I work as an anaesthetic technician. I love travelling, going to the beach. I've got quite a few animals, 2 dogs and a cat, and 2 children, one who is 23 and one who is currently 7. Big gap, but they're a fun bunch of kids. I was diagnosed with bowel cancer in 2020, the end of 2021, just before Christmas, and then last year in 2023, I was diagnosed with metastatic bowel cancer in my brain, so brain cancer, and then followed up by a craniotomy and removal of that. I'm currently 9 months in remission. The first symptoms I had was bleeding, rectal bleeding, but I'd been to the doctor over years having stomach problems. So first it was when I was pregnant with my second son and I had bleeding, and they thought it was hemorrhoids, but it turned out to carry on after I had him, and then it disappeared for a while and came back over time. During COVID, mostly in New Zealand, was quite locked down over that point. So it was very difficult to get in anywhere, and by the end of COVID, it had progressed to being something much larger. I'd been getting gradually anemic over a 2-year period, and then I had got so anemic that I wound up having an iron infusion. At that point, I was booked in to have a colonoscopy already. We have a public health system and a private health system in New Zealand, so I was booked in to have it privately, but by the time my private appointment had come along, I'd gotten so sick off the prep that I'd passed out in the morning and they wouldn't give me the operation. And so I went publicly. I had to go and stay in hospital for the day before my colonoscopy. Must have just wiped my fluid balance out. Get a bit anxious about going for something like that. But they started the procedure. Basically, about 2 or 3 minutes in, they ran into some bleeding, and he said, "Oh, I will push this up further. If it's painful, I'm going to stop." And then at that point, they ran into Tumor, and he spoke to me and said, "I think this is a tumor. I'm currently going to inject some ink, tattoo ink, because that's how they mark it under for CT scanning and for surgery later." And then they said, basically, I've got cancer, and then I was taken back to the hospital ward. Medical fellow came and saw me who worked for the surgeon. I then went home and came back the next day and had staging CT scans and an MRI scan. And then the following Wednesday, like 5 days later, so I went home for 4 days. And then 5 days later, I saw a surgeon. I'm an anaesthetic technician by trade, so he basically squeezed me in. It was 5 days before Christmas, or it was about 2 weeks before Christmas, actually. And he said, I can either operate 3 days before Christmas, or I can operate, I'm on call on the weekend. You can come in on the Sunday and have your operation. So that's what I did. So 5 days before Christmas, I had a high arch repair, resection, and I thought I was going to have a stoma. I went into it being marked for a stoma, but I was lucky enough to get away without needing a stoma. So I feel very lucky for that fact. What they pulled out was a 4 centimetre tumour. During the last part of the procedure, they did a small biopsy on a smaller thing that they'd seen during my colonoscopy. That they didn't resect, but that came back positive with cancer cells, and out of 23 lymph nodes, I had 4 positive lymph nodes. So then I went in for adjuvant chemotherapy. I don't really have much of a family history of a bowel cancer, bar my 97-year-old Diddy, who had a bowel cancer at the very end of his life. Because it was an adenoma, they say it was related to the bowel, and they said it had been there for quite some time. The surgeon, when he said he took it out, that he said that it had been growing for probably at least 2 years. When I first found out that I had bowel cancer, I was really struggling with the diagnosis. I had a 4-year-old son, and my eldest son was in his very last year of university. I think I kind of felt like I was breaking. So we have something a bit similar to what the company that you work for. It's called the New Zealand Cancer Society, and you can get a few free like counselling sessions from them. So I spoke to a counsellor psychologist through them twice prior to starting chemotherapy. About 10 days after my surgery, the specialist called me, said I had non-BRAF wild type adenocarcinoma. The treatment plan for that was a pill type of chemotherapy followed along with an IV infusion day. And then the pills you took for a few weeks, and then you had a break for a week, and then you would start that whole 3-week process again. So it was a 3-week cycle of chemotherapy. I started the first chemotherapy treatment, and I became very sick over the first 10 days. It kind of felt like my stomach was rotting on the inside. And so they stopped my first chemotherapy and said, we'll start again in 2 weeks. At the time, we were still in lockdown in New Zealand, and they were being quite tough with the vaccines. And I don't want to carry on about that, but had to have a vaccine prior to my second chemotherapy starting. Within 12 days of my second chemotherapy starting, my stomach had basically rotted away, and I was spent 2 weeks in our main Auckland City Hospital in New Zealand, with in isolation because had become so sick, and lost about 10 kilos in 10 days. I was taken off that cancer therapy. I was taken off that particular chemotherapy treatment, and they told me to wait for a month before I started a whole new cycle of a different drug. Second drug was okay. It was an infusion day plus a small bottle that you wore home for a couple of days, and that was okay. Kind of just I had all my chemotherapy done through PICC lines, so I had a second PICC line placed, and I was still going to the gym, so I did a couple of stupid things to it. So the second chemotherapy was good. I think I was supposed to go through 6 treatments of it, but I only went through 5 because I was having, as the time wore on, I was having more adverse effects to the chemotherapy, and I also am allergic to a lot of steroids. So by my 5th chemotherapy treatment on the second therapeutic drug, I had become allergic to the last steroid that they could use, so they had to stop. They scan you about 3 months after you've finished your chemotherapy to give it the peak time for use, and then you at that point you're considered no disease. About 6 weeks prior to finding out I had a brain tumor, I was having a lot of exterior stresses in life as well. So I'd been getting migraines, and I normally only sort of had a hormonal migraine maybe 3 or 4 times a year, but I was getting regular migraines there, and sometimes they'd be cluster migraines and they'd last for 10 minutes, but I was having some focal changes. Sometimes my eye would almost seem like it would go a bit opaque during the quite intense migraine, and then the migraine would disappear, and then a couple of hours later I'd get the same thing, and then it would disappear, and then was happening on and off, and then a little bit later on they became more frequent over that 6-week period to a point where it became very hard to do anything, and I was having some small visual changes at that point too. So I booked myself to a GP and went there and told them about my symptoms. She didn't actually think that it was a brain tumour because only 3% of colon cancers go to the brain. So she initially just treated it as stress and sent me home with some anti-migraine tablets. They didn't work, so the very next day, which was a Saturday, I went to an accident and emergency in the hospital with a very bad migraine, and they tried to treat the migraine there for the morning, and then he said if the migraine hadn't disappeared, I'm very lucky this fellow was quite switched on. He sent me for a CT scan. When they did the CT scan, they found a massive brain tumour. I think it was about 5 centimetres by 4 centimetres by another 4 centimetres. It was like a crash and burn. I just cried. Yeah. It was, yeah, because they said, sorry, I hope I don't cry at this point. They said that it was such a massive brain tumour that they didn't know that if it was treatable. So I'd heard of a very good surgeon in Auckland. So I said, if you're going to send me to someone, can you send me to this person? So they referred me there. They treated me in hospital that afternoon, but I went home. I really just wanted to be with my family. And then a few days later, I went for an MRI, which seemed like an age at the time. But daily, I was losing vision. So if you can imagine your eye vision just getting smaller and smaller each day over that period of time. And I was being treated. We have a special system in New Zealand, and it's called hospital at home. So they ring you every day to see how you are, how your pain levels are, and what your medication's like. So you don't have to spend time going in and putting a burden on the health system. Although I had a few episodes where I was rushed into hospital, including one via an ambulance because I collapsed in the driveway. I saw the specialist, and he said that it was a massive operation, but he could do a craniotomy. And so I had an occipital craniotomy 5 days later. That was done in a private hospital in Auckland. There was quite large doctor strikes at the time, so it was done that way. Otherwise, I would have been waiting a month, and I don't know if I would have made the month that they'd given me to have the surgery. My husband and son took me to the hospital, and then I was admitted into the pre-theatre unit. I was initially going to go the night before, but there was really no advantage of going the night before, so I just went in during the day. I was admitted. My vitals were taken by a nurse. I met my anaesthetist for the second time because we'd previously had a phone call. And then my surgeon came and spoke to me about the procedure. At that point, prior to my surgeon coming in and talking about the procedure, I'd sent my partner out because he gets quite squeamish. So I didn't really want to overload him. He was already going through quite a massive amount of stuff. So I sent him out and then said goodbye then. And then after seeing my surgeon, they put an IV in, and then they took me through into theatre. And then put me to sleep. And then I woke up feeling a whole bunch better and actually being able to see a lot better. So it was that was a massive relief. In the post MRI, there was a little bit of small shading along the edges, but over time and the further out I've got from the radiation being done, that has actually disappeared. And the hole that was left behind from the tumour has slowly started to close. Well, about 3.5 weeks after my surgery, I was contacted and given an appointment for 2 days later to attend the Auckland Oncology Services. They bring you in and you go for another CT scan, and they do. I'd already had another CT scan, an MRI scan, sorry, a week prior to this, but so 2 weeks post-surgery, I had an MRI, and then another week later, I had a CT scan and an MRI at the Auckland Oncology Services because they marry up the two images, and then they make a special mask. So you sit inside a special plastic cage, and they mould this special mask to your face. And when they marry up the images, they put little X's on the plastic of the mask, and that's where they put the target beams to treat only the tumour area instead of just firing radiation into your head. So it's quite specific where it's targeted. Mine was very close to my optic nerve. When I had radiation, I had 5 days of high dose radiation. Each one of those took around about 10 minutes. You go into the radiation centre. They are amazing, amazing people. And you go into the room. They pop you on the big radiation bed, the mask that they've made, the head sort of cage thing. They fuss into a bed, and you have to have your hair worn exactly the same way as when you go into the cage. And I had a special pillow made for the back of my head because it was quite sore. And then anyway, they screw you into this thing and they mark out the targets. They let you play music, which I felt quite good. So they let me play music when we were in there. And then basically when the radiation's being done, you can see a series of little red lasers firing around. Even if you close your eyes, you can still see them. I think it was quite close to where my optic nerve was, so I could sort of see the lights going on in my head. That took about 10 minutes. And after each radiation, it's like my vision went opaque for a few hours. And they said that there might be some visual damage 6 months post this. But I've thankfully suffered minimal vision damage. The first MRI scan that I did, there was still a bit of slough kind of that was left, shading that they didn't know whether it was tumour or not. So I had another MRI booked for about 2 months later. And that MRI scan, we were freaking out a little bit for that appointment, but we turned up, and then my oncologist always has the serious face. So we walked into his office and I was thinking, oh no, not again. Anyway, we walked into this office and he said, congratulations, your scan is completely clear. And then honestly, I felt like about a 10-kilo weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and I laughed. And I think my partner just laughed. And it was quite a good day. I'm in a high risk monitoring thing that goes for 7 years because it's a metastatic cancer. So I have currently, for the first 2 years, I have 3 monthly MRI scans, and I'm supposed to have a CT scan on my bowel every year and every 2-year colonoscopies now because I'm that far down the track from the bowel cancer. The New Zealand health system is quite slow, so you kind of have to advocate for yourself and chase them. At the moment, the hospital DHB where I get my colonoscopies is much slower than the DHB where I have my head scans. I think for me, it's just being thankful for each day that you're here and being present with my family. I think one thing this has done for me is I'm a lot more present in my life. Not that I wasn't present before, but I think there's less chances that I want to go and I don't know and not do stuff with my family. I think that's really important, and my friends. My bowel cancer was tested, and they never really got anything back. They just said when I had it removed that it was a wild type non-BRAF. Advocate for yourself earlier when things start looking like they're not right. I think I probably could have acted earlier, but also sometimes when you're a bit younger, they don't often push you towards being tested for cancers, and I think sometimes you just need to advocate for yourself about tests. It took a very long time to get a colonoscopy.